Hello everyone. I'm Eileen Boswell from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, right in the middle of the USA, and I will be presenting my dissertation research on African-born students' intersectional experiences of race at predominantly white institutions of higher education in the American Midwest region, specifically in my home state of Nebraska, part of what we call the Great Plains region. I will begin by setting the research context in terms of explaining how our state of Nebraska and our predominantly white colleges and universities are located within the context of U.S. higher education. Then I will walk through the project design and a discussion of the theory grounded. Labouré has theorized that U.S. higher education was actually part of a trifecta of institutional influence in the history of our country, the three influences being government, religion, and academia. And in setting up my literature review and the propositions that guided my dissertation proposal, I draw on that work, as well as some of the historical ties between U.S. higher education and slavery. This is a popular topic in the United States, and there are several institutions of higher learning that are currently making reparations for slavery. Because of the history of racism and slavery in our country, you may be aware that we have what are called predominantly white institutions, or PWIs, and because Black individuals were not permitted to enter institutions of higher learning, there arose what are called HBCUs, or historically Black colleges and universities. Now, even if Black students are now allowed to attend other institutions, the HBCUs are still very active, and you may be aware that our Vice President, Kamala Harris, attended one, and of course is the first Black, the first Asian American, and the first female Vice President. She is also an alum of an HBCU, which has brought great pride and attention to the HBCU system. So the backdrop to the project also includes critical race theoretical applications, presumptions of systemic racism, and some grounding literature even before pursuing a grounded theory project. I did do a scoped, limited literature review on campus racial climate and anti-Black racisms before undertaking the project. To orient you to where this project was located, Nebraska was not a slave state, but does have a history of subjugation of indigenous Native American communities in and around where my residence is located and in and around where our university is located. To give you a sense of the current demographics, and there you can see the state of Nebraska approximately in the center of the contiguous United States. Our state demographics are about 77% white. That's about 80% at the university. And for the statewide population, this is down from 82% in 2010. So the population is diversifying in the state of Nebraska. It's also an aging population, where 16% of residents are over the age of 65, and that's up from the census in 2010, during which time only 13.5% of the population was considered elderly. I've conceived of the project's rationale and purpose as follows. Anti-Black racism is an urgent problem in our country and at our prominently white institutions. And one subgroup of students who can help us learn more about this problem is African-born students who experience a PWI through intersecting lenses of race, culture, language, ethnicity, gender, religion, class, academic discipline, and other facets of their lives. The purpose of this qualitative study was to generate a theoretical model explaining how African-born students at PWIs experience and navigate a campus racial climate that may include specifically anti-Black forms of discrimination. The central question this research sought to address was, how do African-born students experience the campus racial climate at a predominantly white college or university? And the project aims were, first, to illuminate the asset frameworks with which to view African-born and all minoritized students. Next, to challenge essentializing institutionally centered labels, such as domestic or international, that obscure the nuanced and intersectional campus experiences of Black, African-born students navigating a predominantly white institution, PWI. Third, to propose ways that understanding African-born students' experiences can further a PWI's anti-racism efforts. And finally, to generate an original theoretical model to explore and explain how African-born students leverage personal and institutional resources to navigate a campus racial climate that may include specifically anti-Black forms of discrimination. This leads us to a brief overview of the methodology and design. Eligible participants were African-born students who are or were enrolled in one of 8 IRB-approved predominantly white institutions within 6 months of the interview process. In Nebraska, research participants must be 19 years of age, and they could be any passport or visa type. They could be classified as domestic or international. Graduate, undergraduate, and community college students were all eligible as long as they met the other criteria. The initial data were sampled from 6 interview participants in the first cycle of data collection, and in keeping with grounded theory methodology, theoretical sampling of the data was conducted in the second cycle of collection analysis, during which time an additional 6 participants were interviewed. I followed constructivist grounded theory methods, which I will describe in 4 stages on the following slide. Cycle 1, last spring, included manual transcription of the first 6 interviews, initial coding, and coding memos and transition memos. That was the first cycle. Cycle 2, last fall, consisted of interviews using the second protocol, one that was designed to affirm or refine the 4 fledgling theories surfacing last summer. During the second cycle, 6 additional participants were interviewed for a total of 12, and focus coding began. And also during that time, I drafted pre-theoretical memos. The third stage was synthesis, during which I began a process developed by grounded theorist Gregory Hadley of coding the literature with the focus codes. And this was to supplement the analysis of the interview data, and I tracked progress towards saturation with a theory tracker tool that will be explained on the following slide. Stage 4 was dedicated to drafting prose and diagrams to articulate the theoretical model as I approached saturation. This is a sequence of 4 iterative cycles, and my transition memos document the progression from each step to the next. Last year, Wayne Babchuk and I developed this theory tracker prototype to visualize abductive reasoning in action. And in a nutshell, once a few theories have been adopted, the grounded theorist must then engage in theoretical sampling, during which time additional data are sought to affirm or refine each theory. In this idealized diagram, Theory 3 is abandoned early because the needed sample doesn't exist or is not feasible. Theory 2 ends up being well defined by the researcher but doesn't saturate, while Theory 1 saturates but is not as well defined. Under ideal circumstances, you'd end up with something like a Theory 4 that is both saturated and well defined, and you'd report on that theory. This process is akin to hypothesis testing, but not quite, and it's better suited to qualitative inquiry. In the current study, things weren't so neat and tidy, although the theory tracker did end up serving as a useful tool and part of the audit trail. I abandoned Theory 4 labels partway through because it wasn't gaining support in the analysis. Theory 2, roles or role-bound socialization and racialization, gained limited support but was later abandoned. Theory 3 had to do with the settings in which African students experience various forms of racialization, and that gained moderate support but didn't saturate. Of the 4 original theories identified last summer, only the first one, which pertains to socialization by a third party, fully saturated. However, after eliminating Theory 4, I ended up adding a Theory 5 late in the process, which I called tensions and contradictions, and that saturated alongside the first theory. Thus, those 2 sets of propositions were hybridized in the eventual model, which also included elements of the settings theory. Now, I'll display this process in a slightly different way on the next slide. I had 4 fledgling theories based on the first cycle of data collection and analysis. I used those to determine my theoretical sampling, which took place in the second cycle. The second column here shows when and for how long each of those theories was operable, and this chart comes directly from my dissertation. At the synthesis stage, theory 4 was abandoned, and the others were gaining various levels of support, while the fifth theory, tensions and contradictions, was emerging during the transition from focus coding to theoretical coding. At the stage of saturation and theory development, which happened largely in December of 2021, I ultimately abandoned theory 2 and integrated the two theories that saturated, number 1 and number 5, into the model that I will show in the next few slides. So I'll briefly outline the components of the theory that I grounded, that of counter-knowledge networks. The statement of theory, which appears in my dissertation as well as in its own appendix, is as follows. African students at predominantly white institutions experience their campus racial climate through counter-knowledge networks, which, in apt settings, convey indispensable socialization information that is unavailable through legitimated knowledge sources, such as orientation or institutional messaging, much of which directly contradicts their lived realities and that of their peers. I had a few diagrams to conceptualize this that are available in my dissertation, and I will link to that on the final slide. So in the interest of time, I'm going to move forward through this and refer you to the full document with extended annotations of these diagrams, including the evolution of the student in the counter-knowledge network. And some of the stakeholders and implications of the study are listed here. I will also refer you to the full document, which you can find by hovering on this QR code and scanning it with your smartphone. And there's also a link to my dissertation. So these are just my references. And I'm going to go right back to this slide and end here in case you want to follow up. And please contact me with any questions you have.